Hey, my name is Adam. I'm here with Nick, and we're going to explain how to use promises in Node.js to make multiple HTTPS requests. First, Nick is going to explain how to do this in callbacks and why this might not be a good idea.
So here we have an example of making multiple HTTPS requests in Node.js using callbacks. We're making the request to the API called the moviedb.org, where we are passing in 3 movie titles to the function getMovie: Shawshank Redemption, Star Wars, and Pulp Fiction. At the top of the function, getMovie, we're setting up the request. We have the host name of the API, api.themovie.db.org. We're using port 443 since it's an HTTP request. And lastly, we're performing the request as a get to return the movie and passing in the movie title to the path of the request. Below that, we perform the request and we get a response from the API call, where we then parse the response, which is a JSON object, and then pass in the movie title and overview from the JSON object. And you can see here it is a callback function returning the title of the movie and the overview of the movie. Below, we implement each request by calling the getMovie function 3 times. You can see we're passing in the first movie to the function, waiting for the callback, printing the callback response, and then making the next request to the second and third, and so on. You can see that if we made a lot more requests, our code would be very redundant, and we would have a nested callback moving to the right side of our screen. We just pulled up the command prompt, which shows the return of when we call this JavaScript file. So you can see here we have the Shawshank Redemption, which is the title of the movie, and then the overview. This is the JSON object that we are parsing. And then below, the Star Wars and its overview, and Pulp Fiction and its overview. So now we're going to show how we can solve this by using promises. Adam will now show you and explain how we can do this.
Thank you, Nick. So now we're going to show how we can create these same HTTPS requests using promises. And using promises will allow our code to be a lot cleaner, as we won't have a bunch of nested callbacks in our code. So to do this, we first create a promise up here, and the promise has a callback with 2 arguments, resolve and reject. And so we use resolve if the promise succeeds and reject if the promise fails. So below we have resolve, which takes an argument. So if the promise succeeds, we will pass in the argument of the movie title and the overview as a string. And then if the promise gets rejected, it will pass in the exception. And so this promise is actually defined in the getMovie function. So this function getMovie will return this promise that we have here. And so this is also the same thing as before, as we have the movie title, which we're passing into the function from the movies up here. And we're also going to define a promises array, and this promises array is going to hold an array of promises. So down here we have a for loop for every movie title, and we are going to push the promises array with the getMovie function. So remember, when we run the getMovie function, we're actually returning a promise. So this array right here will be an array of promises from the getMovie function, where we're passing in the 3 movie titles like before. So now I'm actually going to show how we can implement these promises now that we got an array of promises. So first we can grab the first promise from the array by just grabbing the first element from the array. And so to actually run and execute this promise, we'll call the then function, which has a callback with a result. And so this then will get called after this promise finishes. And so this result value will hold either the resolve or reject value from the promise up here. So if the promise succeeds, we have the resolve, and over here we're passing in the title and overview. So this result value is going to hold that inside here. So we can actually console.log that result, and then we're going to get the result for the first movie, Shawshank Redemption. You can see we got that up here, Shawshank Redemption, with the overview. And so now we're going to do the other two promises sequentially. So we actually can return the next promise here. We promise 1, and then we'll call the then again with the callback and the result, and log that as well. So if we do that, we get Shawshank Redemption and then Star Wars. And lastly, we'll do our last promise. Pulp Fiction, and run that again. Don't forget to return it up here, the next one. Then we get Shawshank Redemption, Star Wars, and Pulp Fiction. So these are running sequentially, so this promise won't run until this promise actually finishes and resolves, and then this last one won't run until the second one resolves. And so this is useful, especially if your second promise is going to rely off of information from the first one. So if the first promise returns some ID from the movie that gets the picture of the cover of the movie, and then you need to pass in to another API call with that ID to actually get that picture, you could do that in your second promise. So we could also run these promises in parallel if we just want to get all 3 of the movies and then do something after we return all 3. So to do that, we use promise, and then it has a function called all, and then the argument we need to pass in is actually an array of promises. And so we can just pass in our array promises, use then again, and get the result here. And so this will run after all 3 promises have resolved. And so we get inside the callback we have result, and this is actually going to be an array for each result. So we'll make another loop here for each promise. So promises.length increment, and then we will do console.log result I. So this will loop through result, and we will get each result here. So if we do that, we get the same thing, the Shawshank Redemption, Star Wars, and Pulp Fiction. And again, this is running in parallel. So then after each promise finishes, or once all the promises are done, then this will run, and we loop through to get the result. And so you can see we can easily just add a movie in up here. So for example, The Matrix. And then we can run this again. And now you can see we have The Matrix down here in its overview. So you can see how this is a lot more useful than callbacks, and we won't be tabbing our code to the right. And it's neat how we have these capabilities to run after all the promises finish. So let me know if you have feedback on this. I'd love to hear it, and if there's any ways to implement this better. Thank you.